Okay, it looks like we're starting to fill up, so I think we can get started, at least with some housekeeping. Thank you everyone for joining us on this sunny Thursday evening, at least in Cambridge, UK. This is the Centre for the Study of Existential Risks first panel of the summer, where we're going to be exploring various key questions that, well, occupy us in thinking about our research, particularly getting the perspective of a number of our researchers. This session is called Doom and Doubt, Uncertain Futures and Open Questions about Existential Risk. And you should all be aware that this session is being recorded, but none of you on the attendee side can be seen or heard, and the plan is to have the recording available on CSER's YouTube channel for others to watch. You should be muted on arrival, and I'm going to ask the participants to please stay on mute throughout the session, other than when you're speaking. So the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk is an interdisciplinary research centre in Cambridge. We work on the biggest risks that humanity faces, ranging from climate change to pandemics to the potential risks from emerging technologies, such as artificial intelligence, new biotechnologies, and so on. And we also take a cross-cutting approach, looking at ways of anticipating and preparing for and responding to these unprecedented risks that we face, and all the more of them in the century to come. We're, of course, all dealing with one of the biggest crises of recent decades, and hopefully this will be a spur for all of us to think that there are potentially even bigger threats on the horizon, and this is a wonderful, well, this is a terrible situation, but also a wonderful opportunity to think about how we can be better prepared for future crises. So the theme for today is uncertain futures and open questions about existential risk. The question is, why this theme to start with? This was spurred by the realization that there's deep uncertainty in our fields when it comes to thinking about these issues. Some risks are much more probabilistic than others. We know that it's been 65 million years since there was an asteroid impact. We have a rough idea how often supervolcanoes come along, but other risks are much more unpredictable, or we are entering entirely unprecedented territory where we just don't know everything. We've never had a situation like the current situation of anthropogenic forcing of the climate. That's going to be a set of impacts that's different from anything at least humanity has experienced in the past. The nature of even natural threats like pandemics will be changing as we encroach into new environments and as we change the way that we travel around the world. And of course, new technologies, including technologies that are ahead of us in time, are likely to pose opportunities and threats that we've never encountered in the past. We can think back to 1945 and the first nuclear weapon. There had never been anything like that before, and so that represented an entirely new challenge. And then there's a question of how these emerging risks and emerging trends all intersect with each other. So uncertainty comes into these things an awful lot. We don't know exactly how bad some of the situations we'll face will be. We don't know exactly how they will intersect with each other. We also don't know how society will respond to them, whether risk mitigation will be taken up in time and whether the risk mitigation we planned will work. All of these things mean that there's tremendous uncertainty around these risks and around what the appropriate strategies for responding to them and mitigating them are. And this comes into questions like, what sort of disciplinary expertise do we need to bring to these questions? What kind of methodologies are most appropriate for these uncertain challenges? What kind of policy choices can we recommend at this time for these rare or fast developing threats? And how do we communicate responsibly around these issues that have uncertainty built in, while on the one hand avoiding fear mongering about things that we're uncertain about, but at the same time not resulting in false complacency by saying we just don't know. So we can't be exhaustive on this. We don't have definitive answers to all of these questions, but there are questions that our researchers grapple with on a daily basis. And so this is an opportunity to get kind of an inside view of how some of our researchers think about these challenging issues. And today we will have Lolita Sundaram, S.J. Beard, and Matthias Maas. So I think we're ready to go there. And I'll start by asking all of our panelists, what does uncertainty mean to you? What is your relationship as a researcher to the challenge of uncertainty around global catastrophic risk?
Thanks, Sean. So I'm SJ, and my background is in philosophy. And I think philosophers really love uncertainty. It's, to some extent, our bread and butter. The way I tended to think about philosophy when I was just doing philosophy was it's kind of training in talking about the things that we don't know how to study yet, where we don't have methods for, knowing what's true and what's false, or providing scientific analysis. We just have our thoughts. And there are some things that are always going to be in that category. I suspect that large parts of ethics, for instance, are always going to be subject to debate and uncertainty. And I find that makes the discussion of ethics a really stimulating environment. But that role has also meant that philosophers over time have tended to be in at the ground of founding a whole bunch of disciplines, from economics and sociology to, if you go back as far as kind of Aristotle, physics and biology. Philosophers were there at the beginning, sketching out the logical space of possibilities, and then thinking through those possibilities and asking, is there some way that we could test this, so we could find out more about this? And when we look at the study of existential risk, that we're seeing exactly the same thing. Philosophers were incredibly influential in the early days of the study of existential risk and in founding the Future Humanity Institute and other early centers. But now we're seeing increasingly non-philosophers getting involved and people having more concrete ways to answer these questions. I think that's really exciting, but I think I will always be drawn towards the kind of the more speculative, more analytical aspects of this science.
So yes, I, on the other hand, I'm not a philosopher, have never been a philosopher. I'm a biologist by training. I studied genetics and then parasitology, so very much natural sciences. And so I come from a discipline where on the face of it, uncertainty is on the whole disliked. I mean, saying that, it's liked because the dispelling of uncertainty is where we do most of the research. If you're uncertain about how a particular gene does its thing, well, you use these tools to help try and figure that out. You apply the tools, and now we have a better idea of what that gene does. Now, without getting too philosophy of science about it, because of course that's not necessarily actually the way that the natural sciences work, there is still very much the feeling that there is a certain way in which the world behaves. It is our job as scientists to make hypotheses about those and test them. Obviously, for existential risks, that is very difficult, if not impossible. So on a methodological level, getting into this field has been quite a challenge for me. And that's the case on two fronts. For me personally, as a researcher, it's meant changing how I approach research questions, and also in how I approach the object of my research, asking unconventional questions about the research that's being done in the biological sciences, beyond what does gene X do? So just to summarize, I guess now what I see as one of my strengths in dealing with uncertainty is not getting so caught up in how to solve or to dispel it, which is what I might have tried to do before in an experiment in the lab or something, but to actually highlight the uncertainty and bring it to the fore in arenas where that's not usually the case. So to ask questions like, what is going on in synthetic biology technically and socially? How might that shape and be shaped by the world around it? What is the long-term trajectory, and what can we do about that now? So it's not just about doing the research to identify existential risks, but doing the research to see under what conditions are X risks more likely to develop. And for me, at least, those are questions of scientific culture and norms as much as they are questions of technological progress.
Yeah, and so for me, in my case, I'm coming from my background in law and international law specifically. And so, interestingly, while I have some uncertainty over sort of different risk buckets that we study and how do they compare to one another in terms of the the relative probability and the relative likely impact, and what will be the pathways to that. But as when we get into in a moment, I have some uncertainty around that, but I feel also in general that I can that it's somewhat contained for me, in the sense of feeling that it's still worthwhile to work on a lot of these risks across the board, sometimes especially because they are uncertain. However, as a lawyer, I do come from this background where legal scholarship can sometimes be somewhat aversive to uncertainty, and that is both for sort of disciplinary, sort of doctrinal reasons. So there's a sense in which legal scholarship would like to have coherence of the law, and sort of aesthetics or elegance, and resolving sort of conflicts between and contradictions between regimes. There's also very pragmatic reasons why international law or any legal system prefers clarity over ambiguity. A legal system has to give predictable answers. It has to order actions amongst various actors and people. In fact, if there are unclarities about what the law means, so is this risk not covered by existing treaties, or if there is a risk around nuclear weapons, which parties are responsible to try and minimize and address that? If there is unclarity, that is a vulnerability that some parties can sort of exploit to ensure they don't have to do certain types of actions that we might want them to actually undertake to secure our common safety against these risks. And so from a legal perspective, uncertainty is often a problem to be resolved or clarified or cleared up. And yet working in the field of existential risks now has sort of begun to teach me a bit that we are simply highly uncertain around a lot of questions of in some cases around questions of sort of the empirical dynamics of how these risks sort of appear, how they intersect with our society, and also how we're very uncertain in some cases about, not all cases, but in some cases about what are the best policies to try and address this, and what are the best sort of avenues towards achieving those policies. And so I've had to grapple with that a little bit coming into this field, but it has also taught me that feigning greater certainty than we actually have is not a good strategy, but we do need some decisions and actions to be taken. And so for me, I want to get more comfortable with uncertainty, these underlying uncertainties in my work, and being able to understand, what policy steps or governance steps to recommend to mitigate these types of risks under such uncertainty.
Wonderful. Well, we have a policy question coming up later, and somebody actually, I know we're not technically doing Q&A, but somebody asked a very good policy question, so I might actually just hijack that one and ask it instead. But before we get to the policy angle, which I think is important, to step back, given this uncertainty, how do we choose what we should focus on or what we should specialize in? And are there particular kind of key considerations that need to be borne in mind when choosing how to study these risks?
Yeah, so again, I think I'm going to start from the personal and then hopefully broaden it out to maybe some principles for the field at large. So again, for me, it wasn't a case of coming in, being interested in existential risk and then prioritizing them and then picking one. As a biologist, I came from a field that is pretty universally presumed to be a source of existential risk, or at the very least, X-risk relevant. And so that's, at least in part, what I have chosen to explore. Where does that presumption come from? Is that presumed risk from the biological sciences where we think it is? And how do the existential risks stemming from biology, how do they manifest? So for the bits that I study, for synthetic biology, engineering biology, the risks are likely to be actually quite far in the future. It's not like the climate crisis where the evidence of our past failures or our past inaction is plain to see right now, and like urgency is of the essence. Instead, when I look at existential risk and biotechnology, the crucial components of understanding and mitigating the risk is in understanding and exploring the trends, but also understanding like how humanity could capitalize on the benefits. And one big reason to do that study is to put into place good governance and regulation that can set us on the right path so that we don't get to a make or break moment, or a moment where there is no turning back from disaster. So the question remains, like, how do you do that under uncertainty? Because the path of biotechnology is dependent on so many factors beyond the actual technical capability. And these factors are not clear cut, and we need to strike a balance. How to ensure effective governance now without seeming like you're just going overboard and prognosticating worst case scenarios with very little evidence to back it up. And so how can we think about governing a whole field in ways that are effective at shaping the technology and keeping a degree of flexibility and being future-proof? So those, for me, are the crucial components to study, rather than what pathogen is being worked on in what lab and how are they messing that up. So an example of this is when I was looking at biosafety in DIY biology or community biolabs. So sometimes these are spoken about as though they're a kind of like lawless Wild West of experimentation, where it's only a matter of time before, you know, there's a biological disaster. It's just a matter of the technology being accessible enough. And like, this isn't wrong. There is a case to be made that biotechnology and the accessibility of it is being accelerated. But really what my research was focusing on, what emerged, was a pretty sophisticated picture of regulation and self-governance and norms. And so for me, the key in terms of existential risk is not that studying DIY biology is important because they're doing dangerous things. Studying it is important because it teaches us something about the norms and standards that are being fostered. It teaches us something about research cultures that, if they're supported and strengthened, will propagate as the field develops, as the technology accelerates even faster, so that we can be ready to face whatever the future of biotechnology will bring.
So just to respond briefly to that, and when it comes to the biological sciences, there are clearly a couple of areas that are quite relevant to the question of global risk right now. So, you know, there have been in the past state bioweapons programs, and those could have had some pretty catastrophic consequences. And the biological sciences play a really, really big role in helping us respond to natural biological threats, such as pandemic risk. But what you're specifically thinking about is there's this whole area of like re-engineering biology, synthetic biology, where we're in the early stages, and hypothetically, it may be possible for scientists or even kind of small groups of people to do really transformative things in future, from potentially things that carry a threat to things that could put us on a much more sustainable sort of global pathway, because we can produce and get rid of waste much more easily. But we have a ways to go towards that. And so there's an opportunity for getting the norms and culture in place to think carefully about safety, to have the networks that mean that people are informed about what they're doing, and to really sort of put in place the kind of framework that mitigates risk going forwards. But sorry, I know that Matthias is waiting to come in.
Oh, I mean, welcome to hear back from
No, I mean, that's absolutely right. It's not about going to synthetic biologists and saying, I want to study what you do because I think you're doing something dangerous. And I think hopefully this is something we can come back to. It's about saying this is a field that is nascent, but that has transformative potential in all sorts of ways that we haven't even imagined yet. Let's try to imagine them so that we can come out with the best future, one that allows for, not that allows, but promotes human flourishing while minimizing the risks. So, Matthias, over to you.
Oh yeah, no, I think so. It's interesting because I like a number of these themes here, where it's not necessarily even about getting the sort of like the exact prediction right of did I spot early enough in advance that this line of biotech was going to be a risk. I mean, that would be valuable to find that also, but there's also a value in understanding sort of transferable dynamics. I mean, so an example in my field in international law, where there was early work in, say, the 1960s, where scholars are like exploring, right, what if there would be weather control technology? And that was premature in some sense, because that technology, even sort of like modern sort of like geoengineering techniques, aren't as powerful as what they were talking about. And that has taken at least many more decades than what they sort of thought was the pressure. I would not say that what they did was useless or wasteful. I felt like there were valuable lessons that, if nothing else, could be transferred to other types of technology governance areas, or other questions of how societies should deal with these types of uncertainties while we're uncertain. I mean, and thinking about these different sort of buckets of risk, so I originally came into this field from a focus on like nuclear risks and nuclear. There's a field called normal accident theory, which deals with how organizations that work with complex technologies are set up in ways that, in some ways, sort of inevitably give rise to accidents that are therefore a part of the normal operation of how it works. And so I, in those early on, did a lot of work on, Cold War era close calls, nuclear war computers that had a wrong chip, false alarms that almost caused nuclear war, a bear that was trying to climb a fence and triggered a war alarm. And so that is interesting, because so that was very, it felt to me like it's important, it's very sort of well established as a pattern, there seems that there's a concern. And it felt like something that would be valuable to work on. But as I sort of worked and got into this field, I started reorienting and pivoting a lot of my sort of backgrounds and work on the topic of governance for artificial intelligence and different sort of techniques there. And there's an interesting thing there where there are debates about sort of how AI technology will develop in the coming sort of years and decades. And so when we talk about AI as a catastrophic risk, there's aspects of that I have uncertainty about. I have some uncertainty over what is the trajectory in the coming few years and decades, how fast or how far or what's the ceiling. I am less uncertain and more persuaded by the arguments that if advanced AI is possible, then in some ways that might be not by default a very safe technology to interact with. And I am also persuaded that even if those very advanced AI systems remain out of reach, there are a wide range of existing systems that, if you hook them up to nuclear command and control systems, if you use them in very widespread sort of deep fakes and computational propaganda, are either more than sufficient to be a catastrophic risk themselves, or to really erode our ability to address other catastrophic risks. And so for me, while I have a lot of uncertainty about it as a cause area or as a subject area in an empirical sense, I feel like it definitely clears a threshold of certainty to worry about this and sort of think about this. But while I am uncertain about that, I do, and I think I liked, Lolita, what you mentioned about sort of flexible governance and sort of adaptation, is that a lot of my recent research has focused on this sort of broad portfolio of policies that we could implement today. We can set path dependencies, but we can also hopefully learn early on if we're getting it wrong, rather than try to sort of write a global constitution for when we have extremely advanced AI now, and then just we'll never look back at it. I think so. Within that package of work, it's fairly robust to different scenarios, but I think there might be cases where I would change my mind about what to work on. Say if advanced AI seems, if I'm convinced that this is really close, or that it would come so quickly that there's no time for international governance to really react to it or see it coming or realize what it's dealing with.
Thanks very much. And a few other interesting comments and questions coming in from the audience. One, I will just acknowledge what I think is a reasonable challenge for someone, building on my point about the past of state bioweapons, the potential for pathogens to be made even more dangerous, which I think is one category where there are some potential significant risks. And there's also been a lot of debate about the relative risks versus benefits from a point of view of pandemic mitigation from gain of function influenza, which of course is, or gain of function research more broadly, which of course is a topic of a lot of discussion at the moment. I think we don't have time to go into this at the moment, but I would suggest there is a great debate involving Derek Smith and Mark Lipsitch on our website from a couple of years ago for those interested in gain of function virus research. To move on to another issue which I was keen to cover, given the uncertainty around how to study this, what's the methodology for making any sort of progress around it? It's inevitably going to involve collaboration, but how can we collaborate fruitfully with other academics, especially if we inhabit very different worlds in terms of epistemics and have different attitudes towards uncertainty? And if we are really trying to not only think about sort of the known challenges, but the unknowns that are coming up, and I'm trying not to quote somebody who died recently, like, how do we go about learning anything about that?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the places where my own kind of learning curve has been steepest since I started studying global catastrophic and existential risk, because an early idea I'd had is let's get all of the experts together and let's really kind of build an interdisciplinary team. And I think CSER is just the most fantastic example of an interdisciplinary research center. I mean, we're coming up to 30 odd researchers, and there are no two researchers at CSER who share the same background, who share the same kind of literature that they've engaged with in the past, who share the same skill set. And that's such a great asset for understanding the world, when you can actually engage with people who have very different mindsets. But it has also created a lot of problems and a lot of difficulties, albeit as a philosopher, ones that I really kind of relished. I think many of my kind of most fruitful experiences have been some of my disagreements with our chair of our advisory board, Partha Dasgupta, who's a very senior economist. And we'll start to talk about something about the evaluation of risk or the ethics of future generations. And we'll start having a really big disagreement, and it's really kind of starts getting heated, and you think, how are we ever going to solve this? And then we realize that actually there's a terminological dispute, that the way, for instance, a philosopher talks about welfare is different to the way an economist talks about welfare or risk or uncertainty or rents. And then we get over that. And then we find out what we're actually disagreeing about. And that's always so much more interesting, because I think you're taught so often that this is the way that we do things here because we are philosophers or biologists or physicists or economists. And you're given a whole set of paraphernalia that surround this, that these are your methods or these are your approaches. And there's almost like you really want to defend them. You want to say that this is magic. This is the way that we get to truth. The way to truth is through Bayes theory, or the way to truth is through expected value calculus, or the way to truth is through foresight techniques, or whatever it is that you use. That becomes this sort of really great thing that you've got to defend. Once you actually move beyond a sort of multidisciplinary dialogue where you have people engaging but staying in their home disciplines, and you actually have to start working interdisciplinary, you need to think, what are the real advantages of what I'm doing here? What am I really adding to this debate? And often it's not magic. It's not some great way of providing truth, but it is helpful. A lot of us in many different disciplines have something to add. So as a philosopher, my superpower, my thing that I can bring to any other debate and help people is sort of very basic analysis. As a philosopher, I'm trained to think through any possibility space, logically divided up into sensible chunks that carve nature at the joints, as Kant said, look for the distinctions that seem most significant, and then to think about evaluation, or to think about what the truth conditions for these different possibilities would be. And if I can pass that information on to someone, then that's really useful. But if I say, well, this, it's just logic. It's all just logic. Stop telling me about, your legal theory or whatever, because I've got something more foundational than that. I think we never really get to what the real value of what we're adding is. But then there is also a third possibility, moving beyond kind of multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. We can also do transdisciplinary work, where we kind of leave our disciplines and we say, well, let's open this box out on the floor and let's look at all the kind of tools and the information and everything we've got, and we've kind of moved beyond that stage where we can be honest and open about what we're doing and why it actually adds value. And let's try putting this together in new ways. And I think a lot of really good papers have been produced recently on kind of understanding global catastrophic risk and on developing a field of what I call existential risk studies, but a coherent field of research and study that looks at the biggest challenges facing humanity from a unified perspective, and it develops techniques and tools that can be applied across those risks. And to me, that's just a really beautiful process to see being produced. And it is getting beyond that really easy uncertainty of, I don't know what you're talking about, to a much richer understanding of, actually, there are lots of things here that we don't know to get even working together, but we can start to kind of chip away at those and develop new technologies and new techniques for doing that. And I think that's something that we're really starting to work on at CSER, and it's been very fruitful.
It's not without its challenges either, though. I mean, I've had to completely change the ways in which I work. There is no option for me to, bring a pipette to the office and do my thing there. I've had to figure out how to think and write, most importantly, write like a social scientist, which I have not been trained in. And that's not been easy. At the beginning, I certainly thought, well, I can't possibly engage in these discussions if I haven't had years of philosophy training. But now I can write a paper with a philosopher without knowing the first thing about Kant. It's taken a while to get there, though. And it's taken getting comfortable with the idea of accessing expertise rather than being an expert in everything. So for instance, now I'm starting a project looking at the intersection between biosecurity, that I'm very comfortable with, and cybersecurity, that I have only the vaguest notions about. And my first instinct was to go and purchase every single book about cybersecurity and try and do an undergraduate course in it in the space of a week. Instead, I'm sort of getting to grips with the idea that I can talk to cybersecurity experts while still bringing my own expertise to bear at that intersection and have that be useful and valuable.
Yeah, I can feel the lure for myself of sort of trying or wishing I could be an expert in all of these fields, where that follow this question across these disciplinary boundaries where it leads. But I've also, sometimes encountered places where indeed that doesn't, that doesn't work, or that there's limits. There's limits to how much I have to come to terms with. There's limits to how much one can read in one day, and so I've been finding valuable to get to work on a number of papers or projects where people more specifically bring in their own area and their own background. Another thing that I've sometimes puzzled over in some of these studies and fields here is sort of analytical or methodological uncertainties over if we talk about the development or the societal impact or the governance of an emerging technology, and especially if sort of trying to sort of anticipate a little bit and forecast, to what extent can we use sort of inside view arguments that really focus on what are our best estimates of the recent progress and sort of the future rates of development and progress, and what would be the signals for early shocks and capability leaps, so signals that maybe suddenly AI gets very, very powerful, or signals that maybe it will really hit a wall and not really develop so far. What would be signals to suggest that, lots of countries are militarizing this or not? And so there's inside view arguments that really try to engage with those questions on their merits, given the best available information, and sort of outside view arguments that look more at what will be sort of historical base rates of how often has it happened that we've banned technology before it got, or like restricted or regulated technology before it actually got on the space. So we haven't had many anticipatory bans of emerging weapons technology. It's blinding lasers and exploding bullets in various cases, and many other attempts have failed or have only been reactive bans. And so the question of if we want to restrict the development of military AI, to what extent can we do that in advance? But then the uncertainty I have is okay, if we're going to draw on historical case studies, how do we ensure that extends or is valid, given that there's been a lot of external change in the global governance architecture in the last few decades? And also some domains of governance, such as trade or international security or the environment, all have different features in common potentially with AI governance. So environment includes complex scientific questions and transboundary effects. Trade includes a north-south sort of division and power dynamics. International security involves very high strategic stakes. And these are all sort of, from a certain lens, they're all aspects that you can see in AI governance also. And then the question is, how valuable or how far will those lessons from the past, which are sort of the best lessons we may have, carry us in designing institutions for AI governance? And there's also a question I have sometimes about evidence in this space that is ambiguous, so where you get different people taking the same piece of evidence and interpreting it in opposite ways. And the example I've sometimes found here is to take what I mentioned earlier, nuclear risk during the Cold War, where you have cases of near accidents, so cases of a nuclear bomber crashing close to a early warning radar and almost on top of it, and if they'd crashed together, that so during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that could have been perceived as a signal of a first strike. And so some people see this recurring pattern of near misses, and they say, well, this shows that the system is fundamentally unsafe because it keeps throwing these accident cascades that could go really, really wrong. And other people see this and they're like, well, for some reason, all of these accident cascades fizzle out. We haven't had a nuclear war, and so this means that the system is fundamentally robust and it's safe. And I know where I sort of fall on that psychologically, but yeah, it's interesting to see when people have such deep cruxes about.
So in the discussion, some questions have come about policy, and I know this is something that the panel also wanted to speak about. And so I want to sort of, there's two sides to this, I think. One is the question coming from your end as researchers. So given that there is uncertainty about what we can say for certain around some of these things, what can we say with confidence are the choices that need to be made on some of these things to people in policy making decisions who have to take actions on it? But now to add a little twist from a point that somebody made in the discussion, and I think is a very good one, policymakers are, it can be very difficult for policymakers to deal with risks that engage with a high degree of uncertainty, as we've seen with recent global crises. So there's a double point of difficulty, if you will. So I'm interested in the panel's thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think for me, the questions about policy and what we should be doing, I mean, this is the key point where we need to try and reduce our level of uncertainty, because I think there's a thought that, oh, we need to know how high a risk is before we can really take it to, you know, government or industry or whatever and say you need to change. But the risks that we study are not actually exogenous. They're not factors that just sit out there in the universe and, you know, someone sitting there rolling a dice. They are the consequences of bad decision making. Even if you have something like volcanic risk or asteroid risk, where we have no direct impact over whether we are hit by an asteroid or whether we have a certain volcanic eruption, it's still nevertheless within our power to protect ourselves or not from this kind of risk and to make them survivable or not survivable. So in every risk, the question of decision making and whether decision making will be making the world safer or less safe is actually the key question for really understanding what the risk is. You know, it's what are the choices that people can make that would shape our future for better or worse, and what is the likelihood that people will make the right choice versus the wrong choice. And that's a really difficult thing to assess. It's not amenable to conventional risk analysis. I mean, we can do a kind of probabilistic estimate of, you know, how likely it is. Let's say, you know, 1 in every 4 US presidents is going to be a duff and, you know, will really make the world a less safe place. But that is actually not all that helpful in assessment. What you really need to know is what can we do to change it? What can anyone do to change it? And, you know, try and push everyone towards making the right decisions. Because I think bad decision making in just about any domain can actually lead to disasters, lead to unintended consequences that can be pretty bad. So for myself, when I engage with this, I have to say I tend to take quite a strongly insider perspective. I'm always looking at, you know, whoever I can influence or whoever I'm going to engage with. What is this person's situation? What are their motives? What are their incentives? And what are their constraints? And how can I present my work or my arguments or whatever I have to them in a way that will either motivate them to do the right thing, you know, incentivize them against doing the wrong thing, or help them to overcome the constraints? Because I think a lot of policymakers know that some of these challenges exist and they'd really love to do something about them. It's just, it's not what gets you promoted, or it's not what your boss, you know, tells you to concentrate on. So, you know, we have to think from, in my mind, really quite on a case-by-case basis about looking at individuals, what powers they have, but everyone also what powers they don't have, and what we can do on a case-by-case basis to overcome that.
Yeah, I think for me, so in terms of like policy recommendations and actions, this comes from sort of the position of having in the past sort of worked a little bit in government and think tanks, and then going into academia and having, I guess, much more, well, sometimes more of a relatively outsider's perspective or sort of analytical perspective. And so in my field of AI governance, well, there's two versions of this. There's one version sort of like general sort of like levers for existential risk reduction, where one discussion, a model from a paper that I had like a few years ago was looking at drawing from the field of disaster risk reduction, so thinking not just about what are ways to reduce the size of the hazard. So if we're concerned about AI cyber warfare system or crashing or another like type of advanced AI system, how can we make sure that those systems sort of by default are less dangerous, or they're more easily sort of controlled? But there's also aspects of that is sort of like, what is the vulnerability of our society or our system to these types of things? So do we have institutional mechanisms in place, or are there cultural features that or features are like in infrastructure? So previously, I think Sean mentioned a pandemic may be one thing, and you can have very deadly pandemics without sort of a high lethality rate, and it's maybe a large hazard. But unless you combine that with a vulnerable system where we have sort of transport links across the world very easily, that may not then the hazard may not rise to a global catastrophe. And so a lot of these places, if you sort of segment it out into thinking about, well, what are the underlying vulnerabilities in our society, and what is the sort of exposure, like which areas might be first hit or later hit, you can think about range of interventions. But then specifically in my area of sort of AI governance, I end up thinking a lot about actions along a range of criteria or dynamics. And so one is sort of thinking about, when do we want to recommend narrow interventions? So specifically, we need a policy that bans the use of AI for tracking nuclear missile submarines, because we feel that it's too destabilizing. That's a very sort of narrow sort of product. Or if we have rather very broad interventions where maybe we're not sure what is needed to address risks from more advanced AI, or we feel like we have a sense, but we don't know whether that would sort of, how the world will change between now and when that happens. And so we feel like we should rather work on sort of broad interventions like improving dynamics between the US and China, or sort of like features of how to do cross-cultural cooperation on AI ethics, or having AI researchers think about the impacts of their research sort of before sort of publishing. There's another way of thinking about this, which is sort of, do we want to really work on emphasizing policy for this right now, or do we feel like it's better to sort of field build and develop more of a broad coalition to then, push policy in a broader sort of coalition later? There's questions over, okay, some issues maybe sort of either like rigid for long times, and then have narrow times when they're very plastic and you can push them, and then they become rigid again, and so it's harder for people to push them back later. And I think there's examples I've heard of people discussing how with sort of bioweapons there was a long or chemical weapons, where there's a long process of trying to sort of regulate them, and then during the Iran-Iraq war, when Saddam Hussein started using some of these weapons, there was a huge sort of outcry over the use of these weapons, and that created the political momentum to really move the agenda in a way that would not have been possible, sort of trying to push against a very rigid project or a rigid topic in earlier years. And I think the biggest thing that I sort of, uncertainty I maybe grapple with in recommending policy is how to think about the ideal policy versus achievable policies, and also policies that, maybe they're achievable and they are ideal and that they get us most what we want, but if they would sort of fail or in some way after they're implemented, maybe they don't fail gracefully, and there's a lot of, we're no longer able to have a replacement policy in place, or maybe it just really blows up in a way that creates a lot of distrust between states. And so one thing that I changed my mind about slightly in the last few years is that I used to sort of unambiguously prefer, in the abstract and the ideal, having single global sort of treaties for AI. And over the last few years, for a range of reasons, I've begun to see that there may be cases where this can be complemented by other tools. This is both to do with the fact that global treaties for this topic may not be very tractable, both generally because the rate of treaty formation has slowed down, and there's gridlock in a number of areas. Even if it was achievable, there might be disadvantages to having treaties because they are quite hard to amend, and so they may be brittle if AI technology keeps changing over the next 10 years. And I've also become more optimistic about the potential strengths and benefits of other governance tools, in sort of informal governance and club governance, that are stepping in and at least holding the line for some period. And so this is something that I continue to sort of think about and research about, but I've gotten more optimistic about recommendations that are able to step in and complement and work well across a wide range of political and sort of moral perspectives also.
Wonderful. So we've got, next thing that we were going to discuss is uncertainty about how we communicate around these risks. So given that there's uncertainty, how do we sort of discuss these issues responsibly with many different stakeholders? But just before we go into that, I don't know if anyone on the panel would want to give a brief digression into questions of communication or uncertainty more broadly around the challenge of climate change. And the reason I ask is because we haven't discussed it in depth yet, although it is a major topic of research at the centre. And there's a lively debate actually going in the chat, which I'm monitoring. And it's an interesting one from an uncertainty perspective, because we certainly know that climate change is a thing, and we know that we need to be reducing our global CO2 emissions much more quickly than we are doing it. I do think that there remains quite a bit of uncertainty in terms of how bad the worst case scenarios are likely to be. And this is reflected by the wide range of uncertainties that various reports show. And some of those relate to things like, there are so many of these feedback loops that we're still learning about in terms of reduction of albedo, how much methane there is trapped under the oceans or permafrost, and what that would do to the climate systems, various other things like that, but also how these things intersect with loss of biodiversity, and also what humans are going to do. I mean, maybe what humans are going to do is going to be the critical question there. And even if we knew all the physics then, we just don't know if, like, humans globally, from our corporations to our governments to our everyday actions, whether we're going to do what we need to do quickly enough. So while physics tells us a lot, I think there is quite a lot of uncertainty around how bad it's going to be and how big a chance we're taking in terms of how quickly we're taking steps to prevent it at this point. Now, I know that SJ, you've worked on this a bit. I know I'm putting you on the spot. If you don't feel comfortable answering this, that is totally fine. But if you did have any thoughts on how we engage or how we communicate around the uncertainty that is inherent in what is a very known threat, then I think there'd be a lot of interest from the audience. But I'd also be interested in the panel's thoughts on uncertainty and communication more broadly.
Yeah, I think it's really useful to differentiate between communicating about climate change and communicating about climate change as a global catastrophic risk. Because when we're looking at climate change as a global catastrophic risk, we really need to think heavily about what the implications of climate change are going to be for humanity. And that's a whole nother level of complexity beyond climate change. Climate change is something that you can, assess now really quite reliably with climate science. And actually, the whole climate science has really been settled and very good for a long time, since the kind of 1980s. We've had there are definitely things that we're uncertain about, but there is much that we can model and much that we can understand. But actually, it's not just about temperature, and it's not just about changes in the planetary system. It's about what those mean for humanity, what those mean, for instance, for food security, or for the ability for the biosphere to provide us with the immense quantity of ecosystem services and natural capital that actually we rely on for so many things that we do in life. And we just take a lot of that for granted, but it's not, that's not an unlimited supply. That's not a kind of, we are absolutely pummeling the biosphere, and its ability to continue supporting us in this way is really very hard to assess. So I think, firstly, you've got that question about what do changes in the climate actually mean for humanity, and we need to do serious kind of scenario work and planning for how can we actually do what we need to do to adapt to a 2 degrees world, to a 3 degrees world, to a 4 degrees world. Because yes, we desperately need to focus on not getting there, but we also need to be ready for if we do. And if we aren't ready for that, then the likelihood that it will lead to catastrophic losses for humanity is so much greater. And once it starts to lead to catastrophic losses, then there's a likelihood that these could spiral. You get cascading risks. Food insecurity leads to political insecurity, which then leads to further food insecurity, and so on and so forth. That's the kind of the spiral that we are most concerned about. But that, given kind of how much public attention there is to climate change as a global catastrophic risk, you kind of think of Greta and Extinction Rebellion and so on, the actual amount of research that has been done into that kind of risk is close to minimal. But then there's a further question, which is about what we do about this. And I think, going back to the communication, this is a really big challenge for how much we want to talk about climate change as a global catastrophic risk. Because if your concern is that, then you need to say, well, we really need to start preparing for 4, 5, 6 degrees, because they might happen. And if they happen and we're not preparing and we haven't done the investment and we don't know what we need to do, then their costs will be so much greater. But we almost certainly can prepare for these in ways that will protect us from them. But there's a huge moral hazard, just as kind of people talk about the moral hazard of geoengineering. If we are able to cool the planet, then maybe we won't do so enough to stop emitting greenhouse gases, even though they have all sorts of other effects. And geoengineering is no way going to be a kind of replacement for greenhouse gas reductions. But just as there is that concern, so I think there is a really legitimate concern for saying, if we prepare for the worst case scenario, do we actually take attention away from trying to stick to the better case scenarios, which needs to be our core focus. And I know that within the existential risk and global catastrophic risk community, there has been considerably less attention on climate change, and I think there's something of a consensus that it's probably not a risk of the level of, for instance, AI. I'm not so sure about that, but I also think that it is a problem where many of the tools and techniques and the ways of thinking that we have developed could make a significant difference to the way that these discussions are had. And we could do so in a way that would still, have a significant beneficial impact on our ability to survive these risks. But also, I think that we are one of the few communities on Earth that's really prepared to have these discussions in a quote unquote sensible, grown-up way, that's able to talk about preparing for the worst case scenario without that detracting from the need to try and make sure that we actually face the best case scenario, or at least the least bad case scenario that's on offer to us. And so I hope that there will be increasing space for these discussions within the global catastrophic risk community going forward, because I think whatever your kind of assessment of these risks are, there is a considerable marginal benefit for us to be talking about this and figuring out what we want to say and communicating that effectively.
So I appreciate I'm going off script a little bit, but I also want to throw one other question that I really love from the panel, or from the audience to the panel. And this one is coming from Jonathan Wiener, but we will then need to wrap up. Yes, I'm getting the wrap up note, but if anyone has a quick thought, how do we think about and what should policymakers prepare for when it comes to the really, really unlikely but really high impact possibilities? So I don't know how unlikely or high impact. I guess maybe the worst possibilities in climate change, or maybe the possibility of strangelets coming from a physics experiment. But how do we think in any sort of reasonable sense about the thing that could definitely just make this part of the galaxy not exist, or make the planet uninhabitable, but is way in the very low probabilities? How do we think about that, and how do we how should we prepare for that? What kind of resource should go into these very, very unlikely but high impact events? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? I know that we didn't talk about this beforehand.
A brief thought of it is in the sense that I'd like it if there were cases where people could distinguish between plausible enough to definitely require a complete sort of realignment of our society, plausible enough to justify study and policy, plausible enough to justify study and thinking about this and getting more information about this. I guess in some of the cases you mentioned, I'd be curious about drawing on some of there's interesting work in sort of how certain are we that there's sort of no model error, that we are the example that's given sometimes is the calculations that were made around whether the Trinity nuclear test would incinerate the atmosphere, and some people calculated it might, others had calculated and said they won't. It turned out that it didn't, lucky us. And then a number of years later, they had the calculations about the Castle Bravo thermonuclear test, where they actually sort of didn't account for certain types of reactions, and the actual yield of the bomb was something like 3 times higher than predicted. And so it's interesting to think about how often and past what levels of sort of peer review and checking and in different domains, sort of how often have we thought this virus cannot escape, or I mean, I'd like to probably say more, but sort of how often have we been wrong about that also? But yeah, I don't know if that's a very concrete answer to your question, but I'd be curious to hear from Lilith and Shay.
Okay, so we're about at time. So I'm going to ask the panel if anyone would like to make some brief closing remarks. And after that, I will close out and also remind our audience of the next session, which will be on why technology didn't save us from COVID-19. But closing remarks, if you have them.
I think for me, the sort of the key thing I want to say to anyone is be curious around uncertainty. Don't see it as an enemy. Don't see it as something bad that we need to avoid. I think with things like strangelets, it's really important that people think about this. And actually, when people thought about with nuclear bombs, satellites, the atmosphere, they were able to find ways of doing the tests, and maybe they made mistakes, but it was really good that they made an attempt, and it was an unlikely hypothesis. When people thought about strangers and the Large Hadron Colliders, they worked out that actually there are similar circumstances in certain stars, and worked out the probability that actually this kind of experiment wasn't going on all around us and not yielding negative results, and came to the conclusion that this was very safe. This stuff is not there to make science hard. This stuff is there to make science interesting. This stuff is there to keep us going, to keep us working at problems and improving what we're doing. And what I would really want to communicate to anyone, particularly anyone who's in a decision-making capacity about this, is really try not to be motivated by fear. Try not to be motivated by worry. Try and think, like, how could humanity go extinct is a really interesting question. And it's a question we have to answer. And the more people are curious about that, the more people innovate in how we think about that and develop their ideas and put forward their arguments and test their hypotheses, the better and better we will understand that question, and the more and more chance we have of making it not at all likely because we've solved the problems. And that's the end goal. So, this is a big project. We have to work on it together and be curious about what you can add.
Yeah. From my side, I guess I'd like, in approaching uncertainty, I'd like to think about, just generally for me and for people I work with, that we sort of better map the dependencies we have between the empirical sort of things that we know, or that we think we know, and so how do we think we know that? So the dependencies between certain facts around the world, around technology, around its risks, around the general world of how, like politics and governance, how do changes in the parts of those beliefs or uncertainties in those beliefs translate into what I think Nick Bostrom has called crucial considerations, into sort of large changes to the policies or the responses that we would recommend? And personally, I would want to normalize these sentences like "I don't know" or "I'm unsure," but I want to learn and explore and act within that uncertainty.
A few final thoughts from me. I think picking up on something that I've just seen in the chat and that Matthias addressed in the chat as well. What I don't want is for uncertainty about these kinds of risks to translate into complacency or business as usual, or really preparing for the wrong thing. And this kind of ties back into the policy and the communications questions that we've just had, conversations we've just had as well. I think we need to be careful to communicate to policymakers that, yes, we need to prepare for future catastrophes that are not COVID-19, that maybe look nothing like COVID-19, that may not be viruses, that may not be biological at all. And so figuring out ways to communicate that we might be uncertain about what that thing is, but there are ways that we can prepare in strengthening our resilience, making sure our systems are working, making sure our healthcare systems are well funded. All of those things are things that we need to communicate regardless of the uncertainty that we might face in the nature of the risks. Now, personally, also what I would like to see in the field is greater diversity. Now, obviously that's important for a whole lot of reasons, but specifically for what we're talking about in this panel, it's clear that even just talking to SJ and Matthias, different disciplines, different cultures, genders, and age groups will all have different ways of being more or less comfortable with uncertainty and how we talk about it. So I think there's a lot to be learned. And so again, what I'd like to do is to use that uncertainty in X-Risk to bring in people who don't normally think about it by reframing it as curiosity. So for instance, in biology, again, it's a very small subset of biologists who think about existential risks. And so approaching those that don't by saying, hey, I'm curious about your field of study. I think it's relevant to me and my work. Please come and talk to me. But doing so in a way where the subtext isn't, I'd like to talk to you about X-Risk because your field is probably very dangerous. And my next paper is going to tell you about is going to talk about regulating you. Doing it in that way, approaching it with the spirit of curiosity and collaboration, I think is what's going to be key. So not just collaboration in terms of the content of knowledge or the technical know-how that they bring to the table, but I guess epistemic contributions of figuring out how to think about X-Risk in different ways.
Okay, I think that is all we have time for at the moment. Thank you to the four panelists, and also thank you to everybody who's been engaging a really fascinating and lively discussion in the comments. I feel like I've learned as much nearly from that discussion as I have, well, and maybe that's unfair. The panelists have been absolutely wonderful, but it's only been added to by the excellent discussion that has gone alongside it. Thank you all for coming tonight. I hope you'll consider coming for a few of our future panels. The next panel will be on the 16th of July, and it's called "Why Didn't Technology Save Us from COVID-19?" And again, it'll bring a range of perspectives into this question, including people who are working really on the front line of the epidemic and, well, the pandemic, I should say. And so thank you all very much and have a wonderful evening.